13 students disappeared on a Texas mountain in 1996. 26 years later, a hidden cave was found on a sweltering July morning in 2022. Sarah Martinez opened her mailbox to find something that would haunt her for the next 18 months. Inside a plain manila envelope with no return address was a hand-drawn map, a faded photograph, and 3 words scrawled in desperate handwriting: "They're still alive." Before we dive into this mystery that will challenge everything you think you know about missing persons cases, please like, subscribe to the channel, and comment on what you think happened. Your opinion could be the key to understanding this story. The photograph showed 13 young faces, bright with excitement and anticipation. College students from Austin State University, their backpacks loaded with geological equipment, standing at the base of Eagles Peak Mountain. The date stamped in the corner read, March 15, 1996. Sarah's hands trembled as she recognized the 4th face from the left. Elena Rodriguez, her college roommate and best friend, who had vanished without a trace 26 years ago. Sarah Martinez wasn't just any concerned citizen stumbling upon cold case evidence. At 58, she had built a reputation as one of Texas's most skilled mountain rescue coordinators. The former geology professor had dedicated the last 15 years of her life to bringing families closure, using her almost supernatural ability to read terrain and her methodical approach to investigation. She had found lost hikers, recovered bodies from impossible locations, and solved cases that had stumped authorities for years. But this case was different. This case was personal. The morning air in her small Austin office felt thick with humidity as Sarah spread the mysterious contents across her desk. The hand-drawn map showed detailed topographical features of Eagles Peak's northern face, an area she knew well but had never associated with the 1996 disappearances. The official search had focused entirely on the southern slopes, where the students were supposed to be conducting their field research. As she studied the map, memories flooded back. Elena's infectious laugh echoing through their dorm room. Late-night study sessions fueled by coffee and dreams of changing the world through science. The devastating phone call from Elena's mother, Maria, sobbing that her daughter had simply vanished along with 12 classmates during what should have been a routine geological expedition. The smell of her morning coffee grew cold as Sarah noticed something else in the photograph that made her blood run cold. In the background, barely visible, was a figure she hadn't seen before. Someone standing apart from the group, watching from the shadows of the tree line. Someone who wasn't supposed to be there. Sarah reached for her phone with shaking fingers. After 26 years of believing her best friend was dead, buried somewhere in the unforgiving Texas wilderness, she was looking at evidence that suggested something far more complex. Something that would force her to question everything she thought she knew about that tragic March day in 1996. The anonymous letter writer knew something. Someone out there had been carrying this secret for over 2 decades, and now they wanted Sarah to find the truth. But what really happened on Eagles Peak Mountain? And why, after all these years, was someone finally ready to break their silence? As Sarah stared at Elena's young, hopeful face in that faded photograph, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to uncover something much bigger than a simple missing persons case. Something that powerful people had spent decades trying to keep buried. The dusty files in the Travis County Sheriff's Department basement smelled like forgotten promises and cold cases that had long since lost their urgency. Sarah Martinez hadn't stepped foot in this building since 1998, 2 years after Elena's disappearance, when she had practically begged the investigators to expand their search area. They had politely dismissed her concerns then, citing limited resources and the expertise of their search teams. Now, 24 years later, Sheriff's Detective Marcus Thompson was pulling those same yellowed files from metal cabinets that groaned under the weight of unsolved mysteries. "I remember you," Thompson said, his weathered face creasing into a grimace as he recognized Sarah. "You were the friend who wouldn't give up. the one who kept calling every week for 2 years straight. Marcus Thompson looked like a man haunted by his failures. At 62, the retired Texas Ranger had returned to consulting work specifically to tackle cold cases. Cases like this one that had eaten away at him for decades. His salt and pepper beard couldn't hide the deep lines etched by years of sleepless nights, wondering about the families he couldn't help, the answers he couldn't find. Sarah spread the anonymous photograph across Thompson's cluttered desk. "Look at this again, Marcus. Really, look." The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Thompson put on his reading glasses, studying the image with fresh eyes. The 13 students stood in a loose formation, their faces bright with youthful enthusiasm. Behind them, Eagles Peak Mountain rose like a sleeping giant against the March sky. "We searched for 3 months," Thompson muttered, his finger tracing the edges of the photograph. Helicopters, search dogs, ground teams covering every inch of the southern face. Found nothing. Not a backpack, not a piece of clothing, not a single trace. But Sarah's attention was fixed on something else entirely. In the weeks since receiving the anonymous letter, she had studied this photograph with a magnifying glass, analyzing every shadow, every detail. Now, sitting in the basement office that smelled of old coffee and broken dreams, she pointed to something Thompson had missed 26 years ago. "Look at the equipment they're carrying," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Those aren't standard geological survey tools." Thompson leaned closer, squinting at the backpacks and gear visible in the image. Among the usual hammers, sample bags, and measuring instruments, several students carried equipment that seemed out of place for a routine field study. Ropes, headlamps, what appeared to be spelunking gear. "Cave exploration equipment," Thompson breathed, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. They weren't planning to stay on the surface. The silence in the basement office was broken only by the hum of ancient air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic above. Both Sarah and Thompson understood the implications. If the students had been planning to explore caves, the entire search area from 1996 had been wrong. The focus on surface terrain, the assumption that they had gotten lost hiking, all of it based on false premises. Sarah pulled out the hand-drawn map that had arrived with the photograph. This shows cave systems on the Kaidid northern face of Eagles Peak. Systems that weren't on any official geological survey in 1996. Thompson's hands shook slightly as he compared the map to the original case files. The search grid from 26 years ago covered the southern and eastern slopes of the mountain, where the students were supposed to be conducting their approved research. The northern face, marked clearly on the anonymous map, had barely been touched by search teams. "Why?" Thompson asked, though Sarah could see he was already dreading the answer. Why would they lie about where they were going? The question hung in the air like smoke from an old fire that had never quite been extinguished. Sarah remembered Elena's excitement in the weeks before the expedition, how she had talked about making discoveries that would change their understanding of Texas geology. She remembered how secretive Elena had become, how she had stopped sharing details about their research plans. "There's something else," Sarah said, pulling out a photocopy of Elena's last letter to her family. "Look at the date." The letter was postmarked March 10, 1996, 5 days before the official expedition date. In it, Elena mentioned being excited about exploring areas that most people don't even know exist, and finding artifacts that could rewrite the history books. What artifacts? What areas? And why had these details never made it into the official investigation? As Sarah and Thompson sat surrounded by the ghosts of failed investigations, one thing became terrifyingly clear. The 13 students hadn't simply gotten lost on a routine field study. They had been deliberately heading somewhere specific, somewhere dangerous enough that they had kept their true destination secret from everyone, including their supervising professor. But what had they been looking for in those hidden caves? And who else knew about their real plans? Dr. William Patterson's hands trembled as he poured whiskey into a crystal tumbler, the amber liquid catching the late afternoon sunlight streaming through his Austin home office windows. At 83, the retired geology professor had hoped his past would stay buried along with his academic career. But Sarah Martinez's phone call that morning had shattered 26 years of carefully maintained silence. "I told the investigators everything I knew back then," Patterson insisted, his voice carrying the weight of old lies. The bookshelves surrounding his mahogany desk were lined with geological surveys, academic journals, and photographs from decades of fieldwork. But notably absent were any images from March 1996. Sarah studied the old man's face, noting how his eyes avoided hers when he spoke. Marcus Thompson sat beside her, his detective instincts sharp despite retirement. The smell of old leather and pipe tobacco filled the office, but underneath it all was something else, the acrid scent of fear. "Dr. Patterson," Sarah said gently, "we know the students were carrying cave exploration equipment. Elena's letter mentions artifacts and hidden areas. This wasn't the approved field study you reported to the university, was it?" Patterson's whiskey glass clinked against his teeth as he took a shaky sip. Through the window, the University of Texas campus spread out in the distance. The same institution where he had built his reputation as one of the Southwest's leading experts on indigenous geological sites. "You have to understand," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "It was different then. The pressure to publish, to make significant discoveries. The department was facing budget cuts. We needed something groundbreaking." Thompson leaned forward, his years of interrogation experience guiding his next words. "What kind of discovery, Dr. Patterson? What were they really looking for up there?" The old professor's composure finally cracked. He set down his whiskey and buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking with the weight of decades-old guilt. When he looked up, his eyes were red with unshed tears. "There were rumors," he confessed. "Stories passed down through local Native American communities about sacred caves on Eagles Peak. Caves that supposedly contained artifacts predating any known civilization in the area. Petroglyphs, pottery, tools that could revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian Texas." Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She remembered Elena's fascination with indigenous cultures, her dreams of making archaeological discoveries that would give voice to forgotten peoples. But she also understood the implications of what Patterson was revealing. This had been treasure hunting disguised as academic research. "The Tonkawa descendants specifically asked us to stay away from the northern face," Patterson continued, his voice growing stronger as the truth finally spilled out. "They said it was sacred ground, not meant for outsiders. But the potential for discovery? I thought we could be respectful, scientific about it." The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across Patterson's office as he revealed the depth of his deception. He had given the students unofficial permission to explore areas beyond their approved research zone. He had provided them with maps obtained through sources he wouldn't name. Most damaging of all, he had instructed them to keep their true mission secret from the university administration. "When they disappeared," Patterson said, his voice breaking, "I panicked. If the university discovered I had authorized an unsanctioned expedition onto protected indigenous lands, my career would have been over. The lawsuits alone would have destroyed the department." Thompson's jaw clenched as the full scope of the cover-up became clear. "So you lied to the search teams. You sent them to look in areas you knew the students had never planned to visit." Patterson nodded miserably. "I convinced myself they had gotten lost, changed their plans. I told myself the search teams would find them eventually, wherever they were. I never imagined—" "You never imagined 13 young people would die because of your lies," Sarah finished, her anger barely contained. The betrayal felt personal. Elena had trusted this man, had believed in his guidance and expertise. But as the three of them sat in the growing darkness of Patterson's office, a new question emerged that chilled Sarah to the bone. If Patterson had been secretly directing students to explore indigenous sacred sites, who else knew about these expeditions? And more importantly, who else might have had reasons to ensure the students never returned to tell their story? The whiskey glass slipped from Patterson's trembling fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor like the last remnants of his carefully constructed lie. In the spreading pool of amber liquid and broken crystal, Sarah saw a reflection of something much darker than academic ambition gone wrong. What if the 13 students hadn't simply gotten lost in forbidden caves? What if someone had been waiting for them up there? Someone who would do anything to protect the secrets hidden in the darkness of Eagle's Peak. The gravel crunched under Sarah's boots as she walked across the dusty courtyard of the Hernandez family ranch, the late August heat shimmering off the metal roof of the old barn. Roberto Bobby Hernandez stood in the doorway of his weathered farmhouse, his weathered face a mask of suspicion and something else. Guilt that had been festering for 26 years. At 54, Bobby was a man carved from the harsh Texas landscape itself. His family had worked this land in the shadow of Eagle's Peak for 4 generations, their cattle grazing the same meadows where his great-grandfather had first settled in the 1890s. But as Sarah approached, she could see that the weight of decades was crushing down on his broad shoulders. "You're the woman asking questions about those college kids," Bobby said, his voice carrying the slow drawl of someone who had learned to measure his words carefully. Behind him, the screen door creaked in the hot breeze, and Sarah caught glimpses of an elderly man sitting in a wheelchair, staring blankly at a television that wasn't turned on. Marcus Thompson emerged from their rental car, his badge still carrying enough authority to make even rural Texas ranchers think twice about slamming doors. "Mr. Hernandez, we'd appreciate a few minutes of your time. We believe you might have information that could help us understand what happened in March of 1996. Bobby's eyes darted toward the house, where the old man in the wheelchair had begun to mutter something incomprehensible. "My grandfather's not well," Bobby said, his voice tighter now. "Hasn't been for years. Sometimes he says things that don't make sense." But Sarah had spent enough years reading people in crisis to recognize the signs of a family secret clawing its way to the surface. The way Bobby's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, the way his gaze kept sliding away from direct eye contact, the way he positioned himself between them and the house, as if protecting something precious and terrible inside. "Bobby," Sarah said gently, using the familiarity of his nickname to break down barriers, "we know about the sacred sites on Eagle's Peak. We know about the students' real mission. We're not here to cause trouble for your family. We just want to understand what happened to those kids." The change in Bobby's expression was immediate and devastating. His face crumpled like a dam giving way after years of pressure, and suddenly he looked decades older. From inside the house came the sound of the old man's voice, clearer now, repeating the same phrase over and over. "I led them away. God forgive me. I led them away." "Jesus," Bobby whispered, sinking onto the porch steps. "He's been saying that for years. I thought it was just the dementia talking, but after your call this morning—" Marcus moved closer, his detective instincts sensing the breakthrough they desperately needed. "Your grandfather was involved in the original search, wasn't he?" Bobby nodded miserably, his calloused hands covering his face. "The university hired him as a local guide. He knew every trail, every cave, every water source on that mountain. When those kids went missing, he was supposed to help the search teams find them." The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Bobby revealed the secret that had poisoned his family for over 2 decades. His grandfather, Miguel Hernandez, had been approached not just by the university search teams, but by representatives of a mining company that had been quietly surveying the area for months. "They paid him," Bobby said, his voice thick with shame. "Paid him to guide the search teams away from certain areas of the mountain. Said it was for safety reasons, that there were unstable mine shafts and dangerous terrain. But now I think You think they knew where the students were? Sarah finished, her blood running cold. The pieces of the conspiracy were beginning to form a horrifying picture. The mining company, which Bobby identified as Apex Resources, had been conducting illegal surveys on indigenous lands, looking for mineral deposits that could be worth millions. The last thing they needed was a group of geology students stumbling onto their operations and asking uncomfortable questions. From inside the house, Miguel Hernandez's voice rose again, clearer than it had been in years. They were in the caves. I knew they were in the caves. But the money for my family? Bobby's shoulders shook as years of suppressed guilt finally found their voice. After the dementia got bad, he started talking about hearing voices from the mountain. Said the students were calling to him, asking why he'd abandoned them. I thought it was just his mind going. But what if they were still alive when he led the search teams away? Marcus said grimly. What if they were trapped in those caves, waiting for rescue that never came because your grandfather was being paid to point searchers in the wrong direction? The sound of cattle lowing in the distance seemed to echo the mourning that had haunted this family for decades. Sarah looked at Bobby's anguished face and saw not just a man carrying his grandfather's sins, but someone who had suspected the truth for years and been too afraid to voice it. But there was something else in Bobby's expression, a flicker of hope mixed with terror. There's more, he whispered, glancing back at the house where his grandfather continued his tortured confessions. Things he's been saying lately about the mountain, about sounds he still hears on quiet nights, about lights moving in the caves where no lights should be. What if the guilt haunting Miguel Hernandez wasn't just about the past? What if, after 26 years, there were still secrets buried in the darkness of Eagles Peak? Secrets that some people would kill to protect. Dr. Amanda Chen adjusted her headlamp for the third time as she stood at the edge of what appeared to be nothing more than a rocky outcropping on Eagles Peak's forbidden northern face. At 29, she was the youngest member of Sarah's growing investigation team. But her expertise in speleology, the scientific study of caves, had already earned her recognition in academic circles that typically dismissed women her age. The September morning air carried a chill that seemed to seep from the mountain itself, and Amanda could feel the skeptical eyes of her companions boring into her back. Sarah Martinez had assembled this unlikely team based on desperation more than confidence, and Amanda knew she was seen as the weak link. Too young, too inexperienced, too eager to prove herself in a field dominated by grizzled veterans. According to the anonymous map, there should be an entrance somewhere along this ridge, Amanda said, running her fingers along what appeared to be solid limestone. Her voice carried the slight tremor of someone whose entire career hung on the discoveries she might make in the next few hours. Marcus Thompson kicked at loose stones, his frustration evident. They had been searching for 3 hours without finding anything that resembled a cave entrance. Maybe whoever drew this map was just leading us on a wild goose chase. But Amanda had spent her entire adult life learning to read the subtle signs that mountains used to hide their secrets. The way water had carved microscopic channels in the rock. The way certain plants grew in patterns that suggested underground air currents. The way sound echoed differently when there were hollow spaces beneath your feet. "Wait," she said suddenly, pressing her ear against what looked like a solid rock face. "Do you hear that?" Sarah and Marcus exchanged glances, but moved closer. In the distance, they could hear the faint sound of wind moving through spaces it shouldn't be able to access, the ghostly whistle of air being pushed through hidden passages by changes in atmospheric pressure. Amanda pulled a small geological hammer from her belt and began tapping methodically along the rock face. Most of the strikes produced the solid thunk of limestone meeting metal, but in one spot, the sound changed. It became hollow, resonant, like knocking on the door of a vast empty room. "There," she breathed, her excitement barely contained. "Behind this rockfall, there's definitely a void space." As they examined the area more closely, the evidence became undeniable. What they had initially taken for a natural rock formation was actually the result of a deliberate collapse, stones and debris that had been arranged to seal off something that was meant to remain hidden. Sarah felt her pulse quicken as she helped Amanda clear away loose rocks. Each stone they removed revealed more evidence of intentional concealment. Someone had worked very hard to ensure that whatever lay behind this barrier would never be found. This wasn't caused by natural erosion, Amanda said, her professional excitement overriding the ominous implications. Someone sealed this entrance deliberately. Recently, too, probably within the last 30 years based on the weathering patterns. Marcus's law enforcement instincts kicked in as he studied the concealed entrance, which means someone knew exactly where it was, someone who wanted to keep people out. As they worked to clear the opening, Amanda shared what her research had revealed about Eagles Peak's geological history. The mountain was honeycombed with limestone caves formed over millions of years by underground rivers. Many of these cave systems had never been officially mapped or explored, making them perfect hiding places for both ancient artifacts and modern secrets. The indigenous peoples of this region considered caves to be sacred spaces, Amanda explained, as they moved aside a particularly heavy boulder. Portals between the world of the living and the realm of spirits. If the students were looking for artifacts in these caves, they were desecrating holy ground, Sarah finished, understanding the full scope of the conflict that had led to tragedy. But as the entrance began to take shape, a dark opening just wide enough for a person to squeeze through, Amanda made a discovery that stopped her cold. Carved into the stone lintel above the entrance were symbols she didn't recognize, but their fresh appearance suggested they had been made recently. "These aren't indigenous petroglyphs," she said, studying the markings with growing unease. "This looks like some kind of warning, or a marker." The symbols were crude but deliberate, a series of slashes and circles that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the beam of Amanda's headlamp. Below them, scratched into the stone in barely legible letters, were initials that made Sarah's heart stop. "E.R.," she whispered, tracing the familiar letters with her finger. "Elena Rodriguez." The implications crashed over them like a rock slide. Elena had been here. Elena had carved her initials into this hidden entrance, which meant she had found the cave system the students had been looking for. But when? During the original expedition in March 1996? Or sometime after? As Amanda prepared to be the first person in decades to enter the sealed cave system, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to discover something that would change everything. They thought they knew about the missing students. The mountain seemed to hold its breath around them, waiting to reveal secrets that some people had been willing to kill to protect. But what would they find in the darkness beyond that carefully concealed entrance? And why had Elena Rodriguez risked everything to leave her mark on a doorway to the unknown? The beam of Amanda's headlamp cut through the absolute darkness like a knife, revealing a passage that seemed to swallow light itself. The air inside the cave carried scents that shouldn't exist. Not just the expected mustiness of enclosed spaces, but something else. Something that suggested human presence where none should be. Sarah squeezed through the narrow entrance behind Amanda, her heart pounding against her ribs as claustrophobia warred with desperate hope. Marcus followed, his larger frame struggling with the tight confines, his breathing echoing off unseen walls in the suffocating darkness. "The passage opens up about 20 feet ahead," Amanda whispered, though there was no logical reason to keep their voices down. Something about this place demanded reverence, or perhaps it was fear that kept them speaking in hushed tones. As they emerged into a larger chamber, their combined headlamps revealed something that made Sarah gasp audibly. The walls were covered with artwork, not ancient indigenous petroglyphs, but modern drawings executed in what appeared to be charcoal and clay. Detailed sketches of the cave system itself, showing passages and chambers that extended far beyond what they could see. But it was the signature in the bottom corner of one elaborate map that made Sarah's knees buckle. E. Rodriguez, day 127. Day 127, Marcus breathed, understanding the implications immediately. She was counting days. Elena was alive in here for at least 4 months after the disappearance. Amanda moved methodically around the chamber, documenting each drawing with her camera while providing expert commentary. "These aren't random sketches," she said, her voice tight with professional excitement and human dread. "These are survival maps. Someone was systematically exploring and documenting this cave system, mapping water sources, safe sleeping areas, food storage locations. The evidence of prolonged habitation was everywhere once they knew what to look for. Neat piles of stones arranged for sleeping, a carefully constructed fire pit positioned under a natural chimney that would carry smoke away. Most disturbing of all, scratch marks on the walls that looked suspiciously like a calendar. Hundreds of tiny marks grouped into sets of 7. Sarah's hands shook as she studied Elena's drawings more closely. Her friend's artistic talent, which she remembered from their college days, had been put to desperate use. The sketches showed not just the cave layout, but detailed observations of wildlife, weather patterns visible from hidden entrances, and what appeared to be surveillance notes about human activity outside the caves. "Look at this," Amanda called from the far side of the chamber. Her voice carried a new note of alarm that made both Sarah and Marcus rush to her position. In an alcove that had been carefully arranged as some kind of storage area, they found supplies that couldn't have been placed there in 1996. Modern energy bars with expiration dates from 2010. A solar-powered radio that had been manufactured in the early 2000s. Most shocking of all, a smartphone in a waterproof case, its battery long dead but its mere presence proof that someone had been using these caves for years after the student's disappearance. Marcus examined the phone with the practiced eye of someone who had processed countless crime scenes. "This is a model that wasn't released until 2008, he said grimly. 12 years after the students went missing. The implications were staggering. Not only had some of the students survived their initial disappearance, but they had been living in these caves for years. The question that haunted all 3 investigators was obvious, but terrifying. If they had survived, where were they now? Amanda's geological training helped her interpret the cave system's layout, but it was Sarah's intimate knowledge of Elena that allowed them to follow the logical path deeper into the mountain. Elena had always been methodical, always careful to mark her trail. Sure enough, they found more of her distinctive drawings at key decision points, arrows indicating safe passages and warnings about dangerous areas. 20 minutes deeper into the cave system, they discovered something that made Amanda's professional composure finally crack. A chamber that had been converted into what could only be described as a classroom. The walls were covered with detailed geological surveys, botanical drawings, and what appeared to be linguistic studies, attempts to decode symbols and languages that none of them recognized. But it was the centerpiece of the room that told the real story. A large stone table covered with carefully organized artifacts, ancient pottery, stone tools, jewelry that gleamed with gold and turquoise. The indigenous artifacts that Dr. Patterson's students had been sent to find. "They found them," Sarah whispered, her voice echoing off the cavern walls. Elena and the others, they actually found the artifacts they were looking for. Marcus studied the collection with growing unease. And someone killed 13 people to keep this secret buried. But as they examined the artifacts more closely, Amanda made a discovery that challenged everything they thought they understood about the case. Mixed in with the ancient relics were modern items, newspaper clippings, personal photographs, letters addressed to names they didn't recognize. Elena hadn't just been surviving in these caves. She had been living here, studying, working, communicating with the outside world. The question that chilled Sarah to the bone was simple but terrifying. If Elena was alive, if she had been living in these caves for years after her supposed death, why hadn't she ever tried to contact her family? What had happened in the darkness of Eagle's Peak that was so terrible It had convinced 13 young people to disappear from the world entirely. The sound of running water grew stronger as Amanda led them deeper into the cave system, following Elena's carefully drawn maps. What they discovered in the deepest chamber defied every assumption they had made about survival, isolation, and the lengths people would go to protect what they believed in. The cavern opened into a space the size of a small cathedral, with natural limestone formations creating pillars that seemed to support the mountain itself. But it wasn't the geological wonder that stopped them in their tracks. It was the unmistakable evidence of a thriving community that had existed in secret for decades. Stone shelters had been built against the cavern walls, their construction showing engineering skills that went far beyond desperate survival. Solar panels, somehow positioned to catch light from hidden entrances above, powered LED strings that illuminated the space with warm, almost cozy lighting. A sophisticated water filtration system diverted the underground stream into clean drinking water, and a waste management system that would have impressed environmental engineers. "This isn't a hiding place," Marcus said, his voice filled with awe and growing dread. "This is a permanent settlement." Sarah moved through the community in stunned silence, recognizing Elena's artistic influence in decorative touches that made this underground world feel like home rather than exile. Hand-painted murals covered available wall space, depicting the mountain's wildlife and changing seasons as seen from someone who had spent years observing from hidden vantage points. But it was Amanda who made the discovery that explained everything. In what appeared to be the community's meeting area, she found a collection of journals and documents that told the real story of what had happened to the 13 missing students. "They weren't the first," she said, her voice tight with the implications of what she was reading. "This community existed before the students ever arrived. They were taken in, given shelter, but they weren't the founders. The journals revealed that the underground community had been established in the early 1990s by environmental activists and indigenous rights advocates who had gone into hiding after being targeted by corporate interests and government agencies. They called themselves the Guardians, and their mission was to protect sacred sites and natural resources from exploitation." Elena's own journal entries, which Sarah read with trembling hands, told the story of 13 college students who had stumbled into something much larger than archaeological discovery. The students had indeed found the indigenous artifacts they were seeking, but they had also uncovered evidence of Apex Resources' illegal mining operations that were destroying sacred Tonkawa sites and poisoning groundwater that supplied several communities. "March 20th, Day 5, Sarah read aloud from Elena's journal. "We can't go back. Not yet. What we found up there, the mining equipment, the contaminated water samples, the destroyed burial sites. If we surface now, they'll kill us." Dr. Patterson was right about the artifacts, but he had no idea we'd find evidence of genocide. The journal entries painted a picture of young idealists who had discovered that their archaeological expedition had inadvertently made them witnesses to environmental crimes that could destroy a multinational corporation. The Guardians had offered them sanctuary, but at a price: complete disappearance from the world above. Marcus studied photographs that had been carefully preserved in plastic containers, images of mining equipment operating illegally on protected land, pictures of contaminated water sources, documentation of burial sites that had been bulldozed to access mineral deposits, evidence that would have brought down not just Apex Resources, but several government officials who had been facilitating the illegal operations. "They chose to disappear," Sarah whispered, the full scope of Elena's sacrifice finally becoming clear. "They chose to let their families believe they were dead, rather than surface and risk being silenced permanently." But the journals revealed something even more complex than environmental activism. Over the years, the student survivors had become integral members of the Guardian community. Elena had used her geological knowledge to help establish sustainable water systems. Others had contributed skills in engineering, biology, and communications that had allowed the underground settlement to thrive. Amanda found evidence that the community had grown over the decades, taking in other people who needed to disappear. Whistleblowers, activists, people whose lives had been threatened by powerful interests. What had started as a desperate hiding place had evolved into something approaching an alternative society. But where are they now? Marcus asked the question that haunted all of them. The settlement showed signs of recent abandonment. Personal belongings remained, but no people. The solar-powered systems were still functioning, but the spaces felt empty, waiting. Sarah found her answer in the final entries of Elena's journal, dated just 6 months earlier. The handwriting was older, more careful, but unmistakably her friend's. The time for hiding is ending. Sarah Martinez has built a reputation for finding truth in impossible places. If anyone can understand why we made the choices we did, it will be her. I'm sending the letter tomorrow. The realization hit Sarah like a physical blow. Elena was alive. Elena had sent the anonymous letter that started this entire investigation, and Elena was somewhere out there, waiting to see if Sarah would understand the impossible choice between family and principle that had defined her life for 26 years. But what had driven the Guardians from their sanctuary after decades of successful hiding? And where had Elena and the other survivors gone when they finally abandoned the only home they had known since their supposed deaths? The Apex Resources corporate headquarters in downtown Austin gleamed like a monument to modern capitalism, its glass and steel facade reflecting the October sun with blinding intensity. But for Sarah Martinez, standing on the sidewalk across the street, the building represented something far more sinister. A fortress built on 26 years of buried secrets and silenced voices. Inside her rental car, Marcus Thompson reviewed the evidence they had photographed in the Guardian Caves, while Amanda Chen uploaded images to secure cloud storage from 3 different devices. They all understood the stakes now. The documentation they had discovered could destroy one of Texas's most powerful mining corporations, but it could also get them killed. "We need to be smart about this," Marcus said, his years of law enforcement experience warning him about the dangers of confronting corporate power without absolute proof. Apex Resources has billions in assets and armies of lawyers. If we move too fast, they'll bury us in litigation and make the evidence disappear. But Sarah's patience had been eroded by 26 years of grief, and the devastating revelation that her best friend had been alive this entire time. Elena's journal entries had made it clear that Apex Resources knew the students had survived, knew about the Guardian community, and had spent decades ensuring their silence through threats and intimidation. Amanda's research had revealed that Apex Resources had grown exponentially since 1996, expanding from a regional mining company into an international conglomerate with operations across 3 continents. The illegal mining operations on Eagles Peak had been just the beginning. The profits from the sacred site excavations had funded the company's massive expansion. "Look at this," Amanda said, showing them financial documents she had found in the Guardian archives. Apex extracted over $40 million worth of rare earth minerals from Tonkawa burial sites between 1995 and 2001. They used that money to acquire smaller companies and secure government contracts worth hundreds of millions. The paper trail painted a picture of systematic corruption that reached far beyond a single mining company. Government officials had accepted bribes to authorize excavations on protected lands. University administrators had been paid to look the other way when their students went missing. Even some law enforcement agencies had received donations that coincidentally resulted in misdirected search efforts. Sarah studied surveillance photographs that the Guardians had taken over the years, showing Apex executives meeting with politicians, tribal council members, and university officials. The same faces appeared again and again. People who had built careers and fortunes on the deliberate suppression of truth about the missing students. "They're still operational," Marcus observed, pointing to recent photographs dated just months before the Guardian community's abandonment. Whatever spooked Elena and the others into leaving their sanctuary, it's connected to Apex ramping up activities on Eagles Peak. Amanda had discovered permit applications that revealed Apex's current plans. The company was seeking authorization for a massive expansion of their mining operations, citing new geological surveys that showed significant mineral deposits in areas that had previously been considered protected. The permits, if approved, would give them legal access to destroy what remained of the sacred sites the Guardians had spent decades protecting. That's why Elena reached out now, Sarah realized, the pieces finally clicking into place. The permits are up for approval next month. If Apex gets authorization for expanded mining, there won't be anything left to protect. The Guardian community's entire purpose would be meaningless. But as they sat in the car studying the evidence, Sarah noticed something that made her blood run cold. In the most recent surveillance photographs, she recognized a face that shouldn't have been there. Dr. William Patterson, supposedly a guilt-ridden retiree, shaking hands with Apex executives outside a private club. Marcus followed her gaze and swore softly. Patterson wasn't just covering up his academic misconduct. He's been working with them all along. The revelation recontextualized everything they thought they knew about the case. Patterson hadn't sent the students to find artifacts for academic glory. He had sent them as unwitting scouts for Apex resources. When the students discovered more than they were supposed to see, Patterson had helped orchestrate the cover-up that followed. Amanda's hands shook as she scrolled through more financial documents. Patterson has received consulting payments from Apex for 26 years, nearly $2 million in total. He wasn't just complicit, he was on their payroll. But the most chilling discovery came when they found correspondence between Patterson and Apex executives discussing the student problem in clinical, business-like terms, email chains that treated Elena and her classmates like obstacles to be managed, rather than human beings whose lives had been destroyed. "They know about us," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper as she read a recent email thread. "They know we've been asking questions. Patterson reported our visit to his Apex contacts 3 hours after we left his house. Marcus started the car immediately, understanding the implications. If Apex Resources had been willing to make 13 students disappear in 1996 to protect their secrets, they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate 3 investigators who had uncovered evidence of their crimes. But as they pulled away from the gleaming corporate headquarters, Sarah felt a grim determination settling over her. Elena had spent 26 years in hiding, sacrificing everything to keep the evidence of Apex's crimes safe. The least Sarah could do was ensure that sacrifice hadn't been in vain. The question now wasn't just where Elena and the other survivors were hiding. It was whether Sarah's team could expose the truth before Apex's vast resources and ruthless efficiency silenced them forever. What they didn't know was that their investigation had already triggered responses from the very people they were hunting. And in the shadows of corporate power, decisions were being made about how to handle the threat they represented to decades of carefully constructed lies. The black SUVs appeared in Sarah's rearview mirror, just as they entered the winding mountain road leading back to Eagles Peak. 2 vehicles, windows tinted dark enough to hide their occupants, maintaining the perfect distance that suggested professional surveillance rather than coincidental travel. "We've got company," Marcus said tersely, his hand moving instinctively toward the service weapon he still carried despite his retirement. 26 years of law enforcement had taught him to recognize the difference between paranoia and legitimate threat, and every instinct he possessed was screaming danger. Amanda clutched her laptop bag containing the photographed evidence from the Guardian caves. Her academic world suddenly transformed into something resembling a thriller movie. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice tight with fear she was trying to control. Sarah's mind raced as she navigated the increasingly treacherous mountain curves. The black SUVs maintained their distance, but showed no signs of abandoning their pursuit. Behind them, the Austin skyline disappeared into afternoon haze, and ahead lay the wilderness where Elena and 12 other young people had vanished into legend 26 years ago. "They're not trying to stop us," Marcus observed, studying the vehicle's behavior with professional analysis. "They're hurting us, pushing us toward a specific location." The realization chilled Sarah to the bone. Apex Resources wasn't planning to silence them in broad daylight on a public road. They were being guided toward a more remote location where 3 investigators could disappear as completely as 13 students had in 1996. But as they climbed higher into the mountains, Sarah began to recognize the route from Elena's hand-drawn maps. The SUVs weren't just pushing them toward any isolated location, they were being directed toward Eagles Peak itself, toward the very caves where the truth about the missing students lay hidden. "They want the evidence," Amanda said, understanding the strategy. "They're going to force us to lead them to the Guardian Sanctuary, then eliminate both us and any remaining proof of what they've done." Marcus checked his phone and swore. No signal. "They're using some kind of jamming equipment." The mountain road suddenly felt like a trap closing around them, civilization falling away with each mile they climbed toward the peak. But Sarah had spent 15 years conducting mountain rescues in this exact terrain. She knew every back road, every hiking trail, every hidden path that the official maps didn't show. More importantly, she had Elena's detailed drawings of the area burned into her memory. "Hold on," she said grimly, and suddenly yanked the steering wheel hard to the right. Their rental car bounced violently as Sarah guided it off the paved road onto what appeared to be nothing more than a deer trail. Behind them, the black SUVs hesitated for precious seconds before attempting to follow, their larger vehicles struggling with the narrow, rocky path. Amanda's laptop flew across the car as they bounced through rough terrain that would have challenged a dedicated off-road vehicle. "Are you trying to kill us before they get the chance?" she gasped, bracing herself against the dashboard. But Sarah's desperate maneuver was buying them time and distance. The SUVs, built for highway intimidation rather than mountain navigation, were falling behind as their pursuit became a punishing crawl over rocks and fallen logs. "There," Sarah said, pointing toward a cluster of boulders that appeared to be nothing more than natural rock formation. "Elena's emergency cache." She marked it on one of her maps. Supplies hidden for exactly this kind of situation. They abandoned the car and scrambled over rocks toward the location Sarah remembered from the cave drawings. Behind them, they could hear the SUVs getting closer, engines straining against the brutal terrain. Amanda's archaeological training proved invaluable as she helped locate the carefully concealed supply cache. Hidden beneath what appeared to be natural stone arrangements, they found backpacks containing water, emergency food, and, most importantly, detailed maps of cave systems that could hide them from pursuit. "Trail cameras," Marcus said, spotting the nearly invisible surveillance equipment that Elena's network had positioned throughout the area. "The Guardians have been watching these mountains for decades. They'll know we're here." But they could also hear voices now, harsh, professional tones discussing search patterns and elimination protocols. The Apex security team had abandoned their vehicles and was closing in on foot, armed and experienced in exactly this kind of operation. Sarah studied Elena's map by the fading afternoon light, making calculations that could mean the difference between survival and joining the list of people who had disappeared on Eagles Peak forever. "There's a passage Elena marked as emergency extraction only. It connects to the cave system, but approaches from the opposite side of the mountain." Amanda looked at the treacherous terrain they would have to cross to reach the hidden entrance. That's a 4-hour hike across some of the most dangerous ground in Texas. In the dark. With armed professionals hunting us. "It's also the same route Elena and the other students took in 1996, Sarah said quietly. "The route that led them to 26 years in hiding. If we're going to understand what really happened to them, we need to follow their path exactly." Marcus checked his weapon and nodded grimly. "Sinan to Anturdo Ferenz. Then we'd better move. Those voices are getting closer, and I count at least 6 different speakers. We're outnumbered and outgunned." As they began their desperate flight across the darkening mountain, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by more than just Apex security teams. Elena's presence seemed to hover over every decision, every turn in the trail, as if she were somehow guiding them toward a confrontation that had been 26 years in the making. But would they reach the safety of the hidden caves before their hunters caught up? And what would they find waiting for them in the darkness where 13 young people had chosen death over disclosure? The hidden entrance appeared exactly where Elena's map indicated it would, a narrow fissure in the rock face that seemed impossible to find unless you knew precisely where to look. Sarah, Marcus, and Amanda squeezed through the opening just as the beam of a flashlight swept across the rocks behind them, their pursuers closing the distance with professional efficiency. Inside the cave, the absolute darkness felt like a living thing pressing against them from all sides. Amanda's headlamp created a small bubble of light that revealed passages leading deeper into the mountain's heart, but also showed them something that made their blood run cold: fresh boot prints in the cave floor. "We're not alone," Marcus whispered, his hand on his weapon as he studied the tracks. The prints were recent, made within hours, and they led deeper into the cave system in the same direction Elena's maps indicated they should go. But before they could decide whether the tracks represented salvation or additional threat, a voice emerged from the darkness ahead, calm, authoritative, and unmistakably familiar from Sarah's college memories. "Sarah Martinez, you always were too stubborn to give up on a lost cause." The figure that stepped into Amanda's light was older, weathered by years of hidden life, but undeniably Elena Rodriguez. At 52, Elena moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades learning to survive in impossible circumstances. Her hair was silver now, her face lined with the weight of secrets, but her eyes held the same fierce intelligence that Sarah remembered from their shared youth. "Elena," Sarah breathed, 26 years of grief and guilt crashing over her in a single moment. "My God, you're really alive." But Elena's expression was grim, as she gestured for them to follow her deeper into the caves. "Alive, yes. Safe, no. Apex's security team isn't just hunting you. They're preparing to eliminate everyone who knows the truth about what happened in 1996, as they moved through passages that Elena navigated with the familiarity of long residence. She explained the crisis that had forced the Guardians to abandon their sanctuary. Apex Resources had developed new mining technology that could extract rare earth minerals from previously inaccessible locations. The expanded permits they were seeking would allow them to blast directly through the cave systems where the Guardian community had hidden for decades. "We knew this day would come," Elena said, leading them toward a chamber where other figures waited in the shadows. "When corporate greed finally outgrew its need for secrecy, we've spent months preparing for evacuation, but we needed someone on the outside who could carry our story to the world." The chamber they entered was a command center that would have impressed military strategists. Banks of communication equipment powered by sophisticated solar and wind systems. Detailed maps of Apex operations across 3 states. Most importantly, archives containing decades of evidence documenting corporate crimes that reached far beyond the original mining operations. Sarah found herself face to face with ghosts she had mourned for 26 years. Not all 13 students had survived. 3 had died from illness and accidents over the decades, but 8 others stood before her. Middle-aged now, with families and lives built in the shadows of their supposed deaths. David Chen, Elena's former boyfriend, had become the Guardian's primary intelligence coordinator. Maria Santos had documented environmental crimes across the Southwest. Thomas Brooks had used his engineering skills to build sustainable systems that allowed the community to thrive underground. "We've been watching you for weeks," David explained, showing Sarah surveillance footage of their investigation. "From the moment you received Elena's letter, we've been tracking your progress and protecting you when we could." Marcus studied the equipment, with professional appreciation. "You've been running intelligence operations for 26 years. This isn't just environmental activism. This is asymmetric warfare against corporate power." Elena nodded grimly. "Otoritz, when we discovered the scope of Apex's operations in 1996, we realized we had stumbled into something that would destroy us if we tried to surface. So we chose to disappear completely and wage our fight from the shadows." But Amanda's attention was focused on something else entirely. Recent communications logs that showed the Guardian network had been compromised. "They know about this place," she said, her voice tight with alarm. "Apex has been tracking your communications for months." Elena's expression confirmed Amanda's worst fears. "They've been waiting for us to make contact with the outside world. Our attempt to reach you was exactly what they needed to locate our primary base. That's why we evacuated, and why we're all in danger now." The sound of voices echoing from the cave entrance confirmed that their pursuers had found the hidden passage. But these weren't just corporate security teams. Sarah could hear the crisp commands of military-trained operatives who had come prepared for warfare, not investigation. "How many people know the full truth?" Marcus asked, understanding the strategic importance of the information they carried. "Including you three, maybe 20 people in the world," Elena replied. "Everyone else who discovered Apex's secrets over the past 26 years has either joined us in hiding or—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. The implication was clear. Those who couldn't disappear had been permanently silenced. But as the sounds of pursuit grew closer, Elena made a decision that revealed the true depth of her sacrifice. She handed Sarah a waterproof case containing hard drives, documents, and communication logs that represented decades of evidence. "You have to get this to the outside world," Elena said urgently. "There's an emergency exit that leads to the eastern face of the mountain. You can reach the highway in 2 hours if you move fast." Sarah stared at the case, understanding what Elena was asking. "Hey, what about you? What about the others?" Elena's smile was sad but determined. "We've been ghosts for 26 years, Sarah. It's time for us to stop running and make our stand. But the evidence has to survive, even if we don't." As the Guardian survivors prepared for what might be their final battle, Sarah realized she was holding not just evidence of corporate crimes, but the legacy of 13 young people who had chosen principle over safety, truth over comfort, sacrifice over surrender. But would their desperate gamble to expose the truth succeed? Or would Apex Resources finally silence the voices that had haunted them for over 2 decades? The sound of gunfire echoed through the cave system like thunder trapped underground, each shot reverberating off limestone walls that had witnessed 26 years of hidden lives and desperate choices. Sarah clutched the waterproof case containing the Guardian evidence as she, Marcus, and Amanda crawled through a passage so narrow it scraped against their shoulders with every movement. Behind them, the battle for the Guardian sanctuary had begun in earnest. Elena's voice, calm and commanding even under fire, could be heard coordinating defensive positions with military precision. The 8 surviving students had spent decades preparing for this moment, turning their hidden refuge into a fortress that could hold off even well-equipped corporate mercenaries. "The exit is just ahead," Amanda whispered, consulting Elena's hand-drawn map by the dim light of her phone screen. Her archaeological training had never prepared her for navigating combat zones, but her expertise in underground spaces was keeping them alive. Marcus, despite his age, moved with the fluid efficiency of someone whose body remembered patrol tactics from decades of law enforcement. "Those aren't standard security personnel back there," he said grimly. "Apex hired military contractors. This isn't about covering up corporate crimes anymore. This is about eliminating witnesses to war crimes." The passage opened into a natural chamber, where pale moonlight filtered through a crack in the mountain's eastern face. The emergency exit Elena had promised was there, a narrow opening that would require them to rappel down 30 feet of sheer rock face using equipment the Guardians had cached for exactly this situation. But as they prepared their descent, the case Sarah carried seemed to grow heavier with each passing moment. Inside were hard drives containing 26 years of evidence, documenting not just Apex Resources' crimes, but a systematic pattern of corporate violence that had destroyed communities across 3 continents. Elena knew this would happen, Sarah realized as she secured the climbing rope. She's been planning this confrontation for years. The letter she sent me, the timing of everything. She knew Apex would eventually find their sanctuary. Amanda tested the rope's anchor point with practiced caution. She used us to force their hand, made them reveal the full scope of their operations by threatening to expose them. The gunfire from the caves had intensified, but now it was accompanied by sounds that chilled Sarah to the bone. Explosions that seemed designed to collapse passages rather than defeat defenders. Apex wasn't just trying to eliminate the Guardian survivors. They were attempting to bury the entire cave system and any evidence it contained. "They're going to bring down the mountain," Marcus said, understanding the strategy with horrifying clarity. "Make it look like a natural cave-in. Everyone inside dies, and all the evidence disappears under 1,000,000 tons of rock." As they began their descent down the mountain's eastern face, the night air carried more than just the sound of distant explosions. Sarah could hear helicopters approaching, their rotors beating a rhythm that suggested this operation involved resources far beyond what a mining company should possess. "Military aircraft," Marcus confirmed, studying the aircraft lights moving across the valley below. "Apex has government backing for this operation. This isn't just corporate crime. This is state-sanctioned murder." But Amanda's attention was focused on something else entirely. Lights moving through the forest at the base of the mountain. Not searchlights from Apex security teams, but smaller, more purposeful illumination that suggested people moving with specific destinations in mind. "There are others out there," she said, pointing toward the coordinated movement in the darkness. "People who know exactly where we're going to emerge." Sarah's heart raced, as she realized Elena's final gift hadn't been just evidence and an escape route. She had coordinated with Guardian networks outside the mountain to ensure the truth would survive even if the sanctuary didn't. As they reached the bottom of their climb, figures emerged from the forest darkness. Not corporate mercenaries, but people Sarah recognized from photographs in the Guardian archives. Environmental activists, indigenous rights advocates, investigative journalists who had spent years documenting Apex's crimes from the outside. "Elena sent word before the attack began," explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a tribal historian Sarah recognized from the surveillance photos. "She knew this night would come and made sure the evidence would reach people who could use it." The case containing the Guardian archives was quickly transferred to multiple secure locations, copied and distributed through networks that Apex couldn't track or eliminate. But even as victory seemed within reach, the mountain behind them erupted in a series of explosions that lit the night sky like artificial daylight. Sarah watched in horror as sections of Eagle's Peak collapsed in on themselves, sealing cave entrances and burying passages that had sheltered 8 of her generation's most principled people. Elena and the other Guardian survivors had chosen to make their final stand in the place where their adult lives had begun, protecting truth even at the cost of their own existence. But in the aftermath of the explosions, as dust and debris rained down from the wounded mountain, Sarah heard something that made her knees buckle with relief and disbelief. From hidden speakers positioned throughout the forest came Elena's voice, transmitted from some secure location outside the destruction. "The Guardians may be gone," Elena's recorded message declared, "but the truth survives. What you're hearing tonight is the sound of corporate power trying to silence justice, but they're 26 years too late." The message continued, broadcast simultaneously to news networks, social media platforms, and government agencies around the world. Elena and the Guardian survivors hadn't died in the mountain collapse. They had evacuated through passages unknown to Apex, leaving behind a sophisticated transmission system that would ensure their evidence reached everyone who needed to see it. As Sarah listened to her friend's voice echoing across the Texas wilderness, she finally understood the full scope of Elena's sacrifice. For 26 years, Elena had been planning this moment, when the truth about Apex Resources would finally emerge from the shadows, and corporate criminals would face justice they had avoided for decades. But what would be the cost of victory? And could the evidence Elena had preserved for over 2 decades really bring down an enemy with the resources to wage war against an entire mountain? The FBI field office in Austin buzzed with activity at 3 in the morning as agents processed evidence that would reshape corporate accountability law for generations. Sarah Martinez sat in a conference room surrounded by federal prosecutors, environmental attorneys, and indigenous rights advocates, watching 26 years of hidden truth finally emerge into the light. On screens around the room, news networks broadcast footage that Elena's Guardian network had transmitted simultaneously across the globe. Video evidence of Apex Resources' illegal mining operations. Audio recordings of government officials accepting bribes. Most damning of all, communications between corporate executives discussing the elimination of witnesses with the casual indifference of people ordering office supplies. "The evidence is overwhelming," said federal prosecutor Maria Santos, her voice tight with controlled fury as she reviewed the Guardian archives. "What we're looking at isn't just environmental crime. It's a 26-year conspiracy involving murder, government corruption, and systematic destruction of indigenous sacred sites." Marcus Thompson, now serving as a key witness rather than a retired investigator, studied surveillance footage that showed the full scope of Apex's operations. "They weren't just mining rare earth minerals," he said grimly. "They were trafficking in stolen cultural artifacts worth hundreds of millions on the black market." Amanda Chen had been working with forensic archaeologists to catalog the evidence of cultural destruction. Ancient Tonkawa burial sites had been systematically looted, their contents sold to private collectors around the world, while the sacred ground was strip-mined for industrial minerals. But it was the human cost that hit Sarah hardest. The Guardian archives contained documentation of 43 people who had been eliminated over the past 2 decades for getting too close to the truth about Apex's operations. Environmental activists, investigative journalists, tribal elders who had tried to protect their ancestral lands, all silenced to protect corporate profits. The 13 students were just the beginning, Sarah realized, studying the list of disappeared individuals. Elena and the others went into hiding because they knew what would happen if they tried to surface. They spent 26 years documenting every crime, building a case that couldn't be suppressed or discredited. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, representing the Tonkawa Tribal Council, added historical context that made the crimes even more horrific. What Apex destroyed weren't just archaeological sites, they were active ceremonial grounds that had been in continuous use for over 1,000 years. They committed cultural genocide for mining profits. As dawn broke over Austin, the first arrests began. Apex Resources CEO Michael Harrison was taken into custody at his private jet, attempting to flee to a non-extradition country. Dr. William Patterson was arrested at his home. 26 years of consultation payments providing clear evidence of his role in the conspiracy. But the investigation revealed that the corruption reached far higher than corporate boardrooms. 2 federal judges, 5 state legislators, and multiple officials from the Bureau of Land Management were implicated in the scheme. The Guardian evidence showed that Apex had essentially purchased an entire regulatory framework to facilitate their crimes. Sarah found herself testifying before a federal grand jury, describing not just the investigation that led to the truth, but the personal cost of learning that her best friend had spent over half her adult life in hiding. The emotional weight of Elena's sacrifice was almost unbearable. To know that every birthday, every holiday, every moment of grief over the past 26 years could have been avoided if corporate greed hadn't made honest life impossible. Elena Rodriguez and the other Guardian survivors made a choice that no one should ever have to make, Sarah told the grand jury. They chose truth over family, justice over personal happiness, principle over safety. They became ghosts so that the crimes they witnessed could eventually be brought to light. But the most powerful testimony came from Elena herself, appearing via secure video link from an undisclosed location. At 52, she spoke with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades preparing for this moment. Her words carried the weight of loss, sacrifice, and unwavering commitment to justice. We were 22 years old when we discovered what Apex Resources was doing to sacred Tonkawa lands, Elena testified. Young people with dreams of changing the world through science and discovery. When we found evidence of their crimes, we faced a choice: surface and be killed, or disappear and spend our lives gathering evidence that could eventually bring them to justice. Elena's testimony revealed details that chilled even experienced federal prosecutors. The Guardian survivors had been hunted for decades, forced to live under assumed identities, unable to contact their families or build normal lives. 3 of their original number had died in exile, never seeing their sacrifice vindicated. Every year that passed made it harder to imagine coming back, Elena continued. How do you explain to parents who grieved for you that you've been alive but couldn't risk contacting them? How do you tell siblings who grew up thinking you were dead that you chose your principles over their peace of mind? But Elena's testimony also revealed the strength that had sustained the Guardian network through decades of isolation. They had built a community based on shared purpose, finding meaning in their sacrifice by documenting not just Apex's crimes, but environmental and cultural destruction across the Southwest. We weren't just hiding, Elena said, her voice growing stronger. We were working, building cases against dozens of corporations, documenting the systematic destruction of indigenous lands, creating archives that would survive even if we didn't. As federal agents executed search warrants at Apex facilities across 3 states, they discovered evidence that confirmed the Guardian network's most serious allegations. Illegal mining operations were active at 12 protected sites. Cultural artifacts worth over $200 million were warehoused in climate-controlled facilities. Most shocking of all, planning documents showed that Apex had been preparing to expand their operations to indigenous lands across the American West. The final revelation came when investigators accessed Apex's secure communication servers. Company executives had been planning to eliminate not just the Guardian survivors, but anyone who had been asking questions about the missing students. Sarah, Marcus, and Amanda had been marked for assassination, their investigation triggering a corporate response that would have silenced them permanently. But Elena's desperate gamble had worked. By forcing Apex to reveal the full scope of their operations, she had exposed a conspiracy so vast and so documented that even corporate money couldn't buy silence. As the sun set over Austin on what would become known as the night that changed everything, Sarah finally understood the true cost of the truth Elena had preserved for 26 years. It wasn't just evidence of corporate crimes, it was proof that ordinary people could choose principle over profit, justice over safety, truth over comfortable lies. But what would happen now that the truth was finally free? The small conference room at the Austin Marriott felt like a portal between 2 worlds, one where 13 young people had been mourned as dead for 26 years, and another where 8 of them sat across from family members who had never stopped hoping for exactly this impossible moment. Sarah Martinez stood at the back of the room, watching Elena Rodriguez embrace her 78-year-old mother with a tenderness that spoke to decades of imagined reunions. Maria Rodriguez had aged into a woman carved by grief, but in her daughter's arms, She seemed to shed years of accumulated sorrow like a snake shedding skin. "Mija," the elderly woman whispered in Spanish, her voice broken by tears. "My little girl, I knew you were alive. I felt it in my heart every day for 26 years." Around the room, similar scenes played out with varying degrees of joy and anguish. David Chen, now 52 and gray-haired, sat with his parents and a sister who had become a prominent missing persons advocate after his disappearance. Thomas Brooks held the hands of a brother who had named his own son after his supposedly dead uncle. Maria Santos faced a family that had spent decades fighting for indigenous rights in her memory. But not all the reunions were celebrations. Some families carried anger alongside their relief. Decades of grief that couldn't be erased by explanations of noble sacrifice and greater good. Dr. Patricia Williams, Elena's college roommate before Sarah, had built a career in victims' rights advocacy, only to discover that her life's work had been inspired by someone who had chosen to disappear rather than trust the system. "You let us mourn you," Patricia said, her voice trembling with emotions too complex for simple reconciliation. "We held memorial services. We established scholarships in your names. We built our lives around the hole you left behind, and all this time you were alive and choosing to stay hidden." Elena's response revealed the weight that the Guardian survivors had carried for over 2 decades. "Every day we wanted to come home," she said quietly. "Every birthday, every holiday, every time we heard about someone we loved getting married or having children, or dealing with loss without us. But we also knew that coming back would mean death, not just for us, but for our families who would become targets." Sarah had orchestrated this reunion carefully, working with federal authorities to ensure security while respecting the complex emotional needs of families who were essentially meeting ghosts. The 8 surviving Guardians had emerged from hiding only after Apex Resources' entire executive structure had been arrested and their paramilitary security apparatus dismantled. But 3 families in the room faced a different kind of pain. Robert Martinez, Jennifer Kim, and Stephen Walsh had not survived their decades in hiding. Robert had died in a climbing accident in 2003 while gathering evidence of mining operations in Colorado. Jennifer had succumbed to cancer in 2015, treated by Guardian Network doctors who couldn't access advanced medical facilities. Stephen had died defending their sanctuary during an Apex raid in 2019. "They died believing the truth would eventually come out," Elena told the grieving families. "They spent their last years working on the evidence that brought down Apex Resources. Their sacrifice made tonight possible." Marcus Thompson, now serving as a liaison between federal investigators and the families, provided context that helped explain the impossible choices the students had faced in 1996. "They weren't just witnessing environmental crimes," he said. "They had stumbled onto a systematic program of cultural genocide that was being facilitated by multiple levels of government. Coming forward would have meant not just their deaths, but the destruction of all evidence." Amanda Chen had been documenting the reunion for the historical record, but found herself overwhelmed by the human cost of the truth they had uncovered. Families reunited after decades of separation, but forever changed by the experience. Children who had grown up without parents they could have known. Parents who had aged into grandparents, while their children fought shadow wars against corporate power. "What happens now?" asked Maria Santos, Elena's 70-year-old father, who had never remarried after his wife died, believing their daughter was gone forever. "How do we rebuild relationships that were severed for 26 years? Elena's answer revealed both the strength that had sustained her through decades of exile and the uncertainty that faced all the survivors. "We learn how to be human again," she said simply. "We remember what it feels like to use our real names, to walk in the daylight, to love people without fear that our presence will endanger them." But the Guardian survivors faced challenges beyond emotional reconciliation. They had no official identities, no credit histories, no documentation of the lives they had lived in hiding. The federal government was working to provide new identification and legal recognition of their situation. But bureaucratic processes moved slowly, while human needs demanded immediate attention. Sarah found herself serving as an unofficial counselor to families struggling with psychological complexity that had no precedent. How do you forgive someone for dying when they didn't die? How do you mourn the years you lost while celebrating the life you've regained? The evening concluded with Elena and Sarah sitting alone in the hotel's quiet lobby, two women in their 50s trying to bridge a gap of 26 years. Sarah had aged into a confident professional who had built a career helping others find closure. Elena had aged into someone who understood sacrifice in ways most people never would. Was it worth it? Sarah asked the question that had haunted her since learning Elena was alive. 26 years of your life, your family's grief, all those moments you'll never get back. Elena's answer came without hesitation, carrying the certainty of someone who had faced the question countless times in the darkness of underground sanctuaries. Apex Resources was destroying communities across 3 continents. They had killed 43 people and were planning to kill hundreds more. If our sacrifice prevented that, if our evidence brings them to justice and protects other families from what ours went through, then yes, it was worth it. But as they sat in the soft lighting of the hotel lobby, both women understood that some costs couldn't be calculated in terms of justice served or crimes prevented. They were costs measured in missed embraces, unshared laughter, words of love that had gone unspoken for a generation. The reunion was over, but the real work of rebuilding shattered lives was just beginning. 1 year after the truth emerged from Eagles Peak Mountain, Sarah Martinez stood at the dedication of the Guardian Memorial, a monument built on Tonkawa tribal lands to honor not just the 13 students who disappeared in 1996, but all 43 individuals who had been silenced by corporate greed over the past 3 decades. The December air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of sage burning in ceremonial fires lit by tribal elders who had waited decades to properly honor their sacred sites. The memorial itself was a work of art that bridged cultures and generations, traditional Tonkawa, symbols carved into granite alongside portraits of young faces that had become symbols of principled resistance to corruption. Elena Rodriguez, now going by her real name for the first time in 26 years, stood beside Sarah as families from across the country gathered to remember loved ones whose sacrifices had finally been recognized. At 53, Elena carried herself with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned that justice often comes at prices too high to calculate but too important to avoid. "They're calling it the Guardian Trials," Elena said, referring to the massive federal prosecution that had grown from their investigation. Over 200 individuals faced charges ranging from environmental terrorism to murder conspiracy. Apex Resources had been dissolved, its assets liquidated to fund environmental restoration and victim compensation programs. The trials had revealed the true scope of corporate violence in America. Apex Resources hadn't been an aberration. It had been part of a systematic network of companies that used paramilitary tactics to silence environmental and indigenous rights activists. The Guardian evidence had opened investigations into similar operations across North and South America. But it was the human stories that resonated most powerfully with a public awakened to the cost of unchecked corporate power. Elena's testimony about choosing exile over family had inspired a generation of activists. The reunion footage had gone viral, showing the world what sacrifice looked like when measured in decades rather than moments. Dr. William Patterson had died in federal custody while awaiting trial. His final act, a written confession that provided details about similar operations at universities across the Southwest. His admission that he had facilitated the targeting of student researchers for corporate interests had led to investigations at 15 academic institutions. Michael Harrison, Apex Resources' former CEO, had been sentenced to life in prison without parole after being convicted on 43 counts of conspiracy to commit murder. His final statement to the court revealed the banality of evil that had driven the company's crimes. It was just business. Just profit margins and quarterly reports. I never thought about the human cost. Marcus Thompson had returned to full-time law enforcement at age 64, heading a new federal task force dedicated to investigating corporate violence against environmental activists. His experience with the Guardian case had convinced him that traditional policing was inadequate to address crimes that spanned decades and crossed international borders. Amanda Chen had become one of the world's leading experts on underground communities, helping law enforcement agencies understand how environmental activists adapted to life in exile. Her work had led to the discovery of 12 other Guardian-like communities across the Americas, all protecting evidence of corporate crimes while living in the shadows. But it was the Tonkawa tribal response that provided the most powerful testament to the Guardian legacy. Using compensation funds from Apex's liquidated assets, the tribe had established the Sacred Sites Protection Initiative, a 2D program that trained indigenous youth in the same documentation and resistance techniques the Guardians had developed over decades of hidden struggle. Sarah had found herself transformed by the investigation from a mountain rescue coordinator into something approaching a folk hero. Her willingness to follow Elena's desperate clue had inspired books, documentaries, and legislation aimed at protecting whistleblowers from corporate retaliation. But she remained focused on her original mission, helping families find closure when loved ones disappeared into seemingly impossible circumstances. The memorial service concluded with Elena reading names of the dead, the 3 Guardian survivors who had died in exile, the 40 other individuals who had been killed for threatening corporate interests, and the countless indigenous ancestors whose sacred sites had been destroyed for mineral profits. Robert Martinez, Jennifer Kim, Stephen Walsh. Elena's voice carried across the gathered crowd like a prayer. They died believing that truth would eventually triumph over power. They died hoping that their sacrifice would protect other families from experiencing what ours endured. As the ceremony ended, Sarah and Elena walked together toward Eagles Peak, which had been declared a protected monument after forensic teams finished documenting the evidence buried in its collapsed caves. The mountain looked different now, scarred by explosions, but somehow more dignified, like a veteran whose wounds had become badges of honor. "Do you ever regret it?" Sarah asked, the question that had haunted her since learning Elena was alive. "All those years, all that loss, all the pain your family endured?" Elena's answer came slowly, thoughtfully, carrying the weight of someone who had wrestled with the question through decades of lonely nights. "I regret the pain we caused people who loved us. I regret the birthdays we missed, the marriages we couldn't attend, the grandchildren we didn't get to hold. But I don't regret the choice itself. 43 people are dead because they threatened corporate profits. If we hadn't disappeared when we did, if we hadn't spent 26 years building an unbreakable case, that number would be much higher." As the sun set behind Eagles Peak, casting long shadows across the memorial grounds, both women understood that some stories don't have happy endings, only necessary ones. The Guardian survivors had their lives back, but they would never recover the decades they had lost. Families had been reunited, but relationships had been forever changed by the weight of sacrifice and secrecy. The true victory wasn't in the convictions or the compensation or the congressional hearings that had followed their revelations. The true victory was in the precedent they had set, the proof that ordinary people could choose principle over safety, truth over comfort, justice over personal happiness, and that such choices could ultimately triumph over the vast machinery of corporate power. Elena Rodriguez and her fellow Guardians had become legends, but they had paid the price that legends always pay. They had become more symbol than human, more inspiration than individual. Their story would be told for generations, but they would spend the rest of their lives learning how to live in a world that saw them as heroes, rather than simply people who had made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. As darkness fell over the Texas wilderness, Sarah Martinez understood that some mysteries solved themselves not through investigation, but through the courage of people willing to sacrifice everything for truth. Elena's story was over, but its legacy would continue as long as there were people willing to stand against power, regardless of the personal cost. In the end, that might be the most important truth of all, that ordinary people faced with extraordinary evil can choose to become extraordinary themselves. This story left you as impacted as it did me. Don't forget to like, subscribe to the channel and comment your opinion below. Each comment is like a new piece that can help unravel other mysteries like this one. Sometimes the most important stories are the ones that remind us that heroes aren't born from superpowers, but from the simple decision to do what's right, no matter how much it costs.